WTN. Susan sent us an email. Susan says, I'm confused about what it means to be a Catholic who receives the sacraments and has a prayer life versus being a Catholic mystic. Is there a greater benefit to being more mystical? Are mystics closer to God than the mere mortal who prays and participates in the sacraments?
Great question. It all depends on the meaning of the word mystical. And as it turns out, the Church has a pretty clear understanding of what mystical means. And believe it or not, it's not what most people think mystical means.
Okay.
Most people think that mystics are individuals that have really far out there experiences, real wacky stuff. You know, they levitate, they float around, they hear Jesus and Mary talking to them, they see visions, they dream dreams. They have all kinds of wild stuff going on. And that's the typical picture of the mystic. They sort of conflate mystic with visionary. Now, my favorite story about this comes from the life of St. Thomas Aquinas. There is a legend about St. Thomas. I don't know if it's true or not, but it doesn't matter. The point of the story is evident. There's a legend about St. Thomas Aquinas. Of course, was the Church's greatest theologian and incredibly holy doctor of the Church. Thomas was told in the 13th century when he lived, Thomas, there is this nun over here that levitates. I mean, when she prays, she goes into an ecstasy and she floats 5 feet off the ground. You've got to come see her. So Thomas was not a skinny man, and so he lifted his ponderous bulk and said, all right, I'll come. And he lumbers out the door, and they go, wherever they go, and they enter the convent, and they walk in, and sure enough, there's the nun 5 feet off the ground. Thomas looks at her, and he says, she has big feet. Whereupon the nun comes out of her trance and is indignant that he would mention the size of her feet. Whereupon Thomas exhorts her to seek greater humility.
Wow.
And then goes back to his theology books and saying Mass.
Wow.
In other words, he was unflappable. He didn't care if you could float 5 feet off the ground. He wanted to know if you had the virtue of humility, if you had all of the virtues, if you were charitable and faithful and hopeful and just and temperate and prudent and had fortitude. These are the things he cared about, not whether you could float off the ground. So that's not what the Church means by mysticism. It doesn't mean being able to float or see visions or dream dreams. Mystical means that a person's interior life is genuinely transformed into the likeness and image of Jesus, that we have not just an intellectual knowledge of the faith and its doctrines, but an experiential knowledge of them. We are really conformed to the Blessed Trinity that we venerate. We really become like the God-man that we worship. We offer our bodies along with the body and blood of Christ that we believe in the Eucharist. So the Eucharist is not a mere rite to us, it's an occasion to give ourselves entirely to God. And so the sacraments and the mysteries and the doctrines of the Church don't just work upon our minds, they transform our character. And the Church has a very developed theology of how this takes place over the course of a lifetime. So the beginning stage of the mystical life is a commitment to purify yourself of all things that contaminate flesh or spirit out of reverence for God. This an ascetical path of cutting yourself off from sin and occasions of sin. Then you begin the illuminative way, which is a transformation of your consciousness so that you come to see the world as Jesus sees it. Your thinking, your imagination, your memory, your thoughts are transformed after the pattern of Christ's own mind.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the beginning of a supernatural state. This comes about by the Holy Spirit dwelling within you. St. Paul says that we who have the Spirit have the mind of Christ. That's the illumination of the conscience and the intellect by the Holy Spirit. And then the final stage is this union with God, which is the complete conformity of the will to God, which St. John of the Cross tells us cannot take place without serious internal suffering. And you've often heard the expression, the dark night of the soul. Many people think that refers to depression. It does not refer to depression. Any narcissistic neurotic can be blessed with depression, right? We're talking about a deeply spiritual experience where a person learns to reach out and trust in God in spite of his entire experience of the faith appearing to him as darkness, where he, like the psalmist in Psalm 88, he feels devoid of spiritual help or comfort, or even an ability to grasp or understand the doctrines of the faith, and yet he presses on anyway in sheer faith into this experience of pain and suffering and comes out the other side with this transformed experience of grace. So it's a long, hard path to union with God.
Mm-hmm.
It's far more difficult than just seeing visions and dreaming dreams. Any Tom, Dick, or Harry can have visions and dream dreams, but it takes a saint really to be a true mystic in this sense. And can you become a mystic like that in the way that you described, which is just the patient endurance in doing good, going to the sacraments, maintaining your prayer life? Yes, that life of prayer lived with great generosity and authenticity is the normal way of sanctity. But the difference is most of us don't approach the doctrines and the practices and the sacraments and the teachings and the prayers of the church with the kind of generosity of spirit necessary to truly become a saint. Most of us are content with a kind of half-baked Catholicism where we go through the motions. But if you really apply yourself with the desire to become a saint, no matter what, yes, the rites of the church, that's why they're there, is to bring us to holiness.